They said I was cold. They said I was heartless. They said I stood at my own mother's graveside at Trinity Episcopal Church on the bluffs above the Mississippi River on a November afternoon in 1892 and did not shed one tear, and that no decent daughter could do such a thing. My sister Cecile wept so beautifully that 3 women offered her handkerchiefs and 2 men escorted her to a chair beneath the magnolia tree in the churchyard because her grief was so consuming she could not stand. People gathered around Cecile. People held Cecile. People said what a devoted daughter, what a tender heart, how deeply she must have loved her mother, and they looked at me, standing 6 feet from the coffin, with my hands folded and my face arranged and my eyes as dry as the November dust on the church road, and they drew their conclusions, cold, heartless, unnatural. The Trent girl who could not even cry for her own mother. That was 35 years ago. The verdict has not been revised. I have lived in this town for 77 years, and the town has a long memory, and the memory it has of me is the dry-eyed daughter at the funeral, and I have never corrected this memory because correcting it would require me to explain things about my mother that I will not explain to people who did not earn the right to hear them. But I am 77 years old, and my mother has been dead for 35 years, and the people who whispered at the funeral are mostly dead themselves, and I find that I am tired of carrying a defense I have never been permitted to deliver. So I will deliver it now, to the air, to whoever is listening, to the ghost of Augusta Clement Trent, who may or may not be in a position to hear it, and who may or may not understand it, and who may or may not forgive me for it. I do not know. I have never known what my mother understood about me. She understood tears. She did not understand their absence. I should tell you about Natchez because Natchez is not merely where this happened. Natchez is what happened. The town is the story, and the story is the town, and you cannot understand one without the other. Natchez sits on a bluff 200 feet above the Mississippi River. The bluff is the fact that organizes everything. On top of the bluff, the grand houses, the white columns, the gardens with the roses and the boxwood, the churches with the tall steeples, the families with the old names. Below the bluff, Natchez under the hill, which was the river landing, the flatboat district, the place where the taverns and the gambling halls and the women who worked in them conducted their business in the mud beside the water. Everything in Natchez was vertical. You lived up or you lived down, and the distance between the two was not merely geographical, it was moral, social, spiritual. The people on top looked down at the people below and believed the elevation was deserved. The people below looked up and believed the elevation was stolen. Both were correct in ways that neither would have admitted. My family lived on top, then we lived in the middle, then we lived near the bottom. The descent took approximately 12 years, and it was accomplished by my father, Darius Trent, with the systematic efficiency of a man whose particular talent was the conversion of assets into nothing. My father was a gambler. I will say this plainly because plainness is what I have practiced for 65 years in place of tears, and I see no reason to abandon it now. Darius Trent gambled. He gambled on horses at the Pharsalia racetrack south of town, where the planters ran their thoroughbreds and wagered sums that would have fed a working family for a year. He gambled at faro tables in the establishments under the hill where the dealers knew him by name and extended him credit because a Trent was good for it, or had been good for it, or was assumed to be good for it because the name still carried weight even after the fortune behind it had evaporated. He gambled on cotton futures, betting on the price of a crop that had not yet been planted in fields he did not own with money he did not have. He was charming about it. I will give him that. He lost with grace. He borrowed with elegance. He descended the bluff 1 degree at a time with such good manners that people almost did not notice he was falling. My mother noticed. My mother noticed everything because noticing was what she did instead of acting, and what she did after noticing was cry. Augusta Clement Trent, born 1826 in Natchez to a family that had been prominent and was no longer, though they maintained the appearance of prominence with a dedication that I now recognize as a form of art and then recognize as a form of dishonesty. Augusta was raised to be a lady. This is a specific word in Natchez, and it means a specific thing. A lady was beautiful. Augusta was beautiful. A lady was accomplished. Augusta played piano with genuine skill and spoke French with an accent her teacher from New Orleans had praised. A lady was gracious. Augusta could enter a room and make every person in it feel welcomed and valued and attended to. A lady was ornamental. This is the word I keep returning to because it is the word that explains everything. Augusta was raised to be an ornament, a beautiful, accomplished, gracious decoration for a household managed by a man. She was not raised to manage money. She was not raised to negotiate with creditors. She was not raised to make decisions about property or employment or the practical logistics of keeping a family alive when the man who was supposed to keep it alive was betting the grocery money on a horse named Jubilee at the Pharsalia track. She was raised to cry. I do not mean that anyone sat her down and instructed her in weeping. I mean that the world she was raised in provided her with exactly one response to adversity, and that response was tears. When a lady was distressed, she cried. When a lady was frightened, she cried. When a lady was angry, she cried, because anger was not permitted, and the pressure had to go somewhere, and tears were the only permitted channel. Crying was what ladies did. Acting was what men did. And when the man responsible for acting was at the faro table losing the last of the money, the lady was left with nothing but tears and a handkerchief and the desperate hope that someone would see her weeping and do something about the situation she could not address herself. Nobody ever did. That is the part I need you to understand. Nobody ever saw my mother cry and then fix the thing she was crying about. The tears accomplished nothing. They were a signal without a receiver. She sent the signal, and the signal went out into the air and dissipated, and the creditors still came, and the furniture was still taken, and the house was still lost, and the children were still hungry, and Augusta was still crying, and nothing changed as a result of any tear she ever shed. I was 8 years old the first time I understood this. I remember the morning with a clarity that has not diminished in 69 years. We had no food. My father had been gone for 2 days. The pantry was empty except for a tin of flour that had weevils in it and a jar of sorghum. I was hungry. Cecile was hungry. Cecile was 4, and she was crying because she was hungry, which was a reasonable thing for a 4-year-old to do. My mother was sitting at the kitchen table, and she was also crying. Not the same kind of crying as Cecile. Cecile was crying for food. My mother was crying about the situation, about the absence of food, about the failure of the man who should have provided it, about the distance between the life she had been promised and the life she was living. She was crying about all of it, and while she was crying, Cecile was still hungry. I looked at my mother. I looked at Cecile. I looked at the empty pantry. And I did the calculation that would define the rest of my life. Crying produces no food. Walking to grandmother's house produces food. Grandmother Clement lived 3 miles north on the old Trace Road. She was a difficult woman, but she would not let her grandchildren starve. I put on my shoes. I walked 3 miles. I asked my grandmother for food. She gave me a basket with bread, salt pork, 2 jars of preserved peaches, and a look of contempt directed not at me, but at my absent father and my present mother, both of whom had failed in their respective obligations. I walked 3 miles back. I fed Cecile. I put food on the table. My mother was still at the kitchen table. She had stopped crying. She ate what I had brought. She did not ask where I had been. She did not thank me. She simply ate with the mechanical movements of a woman who had exhausted her only response and was waiting for the energy to produce it again. I was 8 years old, and I had learned the lesson that would govern everything. Tears change nothing. Action changes things. My mother chose tears. I would choose action. That was the division, and it was permanent. I watched it happen again and again. When I was 12, creditors came to the house. We were in a rented place on Commerce Street by then, halfway down the bluff, to take the furniture. They had a writ. They had the legal right to remove specific items to satisfy a debt my father had incurred. My mother stood in the parlor watching the men carry out her chairs, her table, a mirror that had belonged to her grandmother, tears, streaming, silent, her hands at her sides, not objecting, not asking to see the documentation, not requesting time, not doing one single thing except producing tears that fell on the floor and were stepped over by the men carrying the furniture. I stepped in front of them. I was 12 years old, a girl in a patched dress, and I asked the lead man to show me the writ. He looked at me with surprise, then amusement, then something closer to respect when I read the writ, which I could do because I had taught myself by reading every document I could find in my father's abandoned desk, and I pointed out that the writ specified the parlor furniture but did not specify the kitchen table, which they were also attempting to take. The man looked at the writ again. I was correct. They left the kitchen table. It was a small victory, meaningless in the larger scope of my father's ruination, but it was mine. I had done something. My mother had produced tears. I had produced a result. Before we continue, a quick word. I've released 14 full recordings that will never be on YouTube. These are the voices too personal, too raw to share publicly, completely unedited, nothing cut. If you want access, the link is in the description. It's called The Lost Recordings, and getting it helps us keep making these videos. All right, back to the story. When I was 14, my father disappeared for 3 days. Not an unusual occurrence, but a particularly devastating one because we had been relying on his promise to collect payment for a delivery of cordwood he had arranged. The payment did not arrive because he did not collect it, because he was at the faro table under the hill. My mother took to her bed, weeping, unable to function. The word unable is important because I do not believe she was unwilling. I believe she was genuinely unable. The machinery her world had installed in her had exactly one setting, and when that setting was overwhelmed, the entire system shut down. She lay in bed and she cried and she could not get up. I was 14. I cooked for Cecile, who was 10. I washed clothes. I tended the small garden behind the rented house that provided most of our vegetables. I managed. I managed because someone had to, and the only other option was to lie in bed beside my mother and cry. And I could not do that because the crying was the disease and I would not be infected by it. I managed, and my mother wept, and Cecile watched us both and chose eventually to become our mother rather than me, which I understood and did not blame her for because the crying was easier, and the crying was what ladies did, and Cecile wanted to be a lady, and I wanted to be alive. The vow, I should call it what it was. Not a decision made rationally in a moment of calm reflection. A vow made in fury by a girl who was too young to understand what she was surrendering. I was 15, I think, or 14. The exact moment is lost, but the content is not. I vowed that I would not cry. Not when I was sad, not when I was afraid, not when I was hurt, not when the world took things from me, which it had been doing since I was old enough to notice. I would not cry because crying was what my mother did, and my mother's crying had not saved us from anything, and I would save myself through other means, through work, through will, through the refusal to be ornamental, to be decorative, to be a beautiful weeping object that the world could look at with sympathy, and then step over on its way to take the furniture. My father died in 1867. Liver failure. the consequence of years of drinking that had accompanied the gambling, the two vices feeding each other in a spiral that ended in a rented room with yellow skin and a belly swollen with fluid, and a death that was neither dramatic nor dignified. My mother cried. She cried for weeks. She cried for the husband who had destroyed her and whom she had loved regardless, or perhaps because of. I have never understood the mechanics of my mother's love for my father, and I have stopped trying. She cried and I managed. I was 17. I got work as a seamstress. I was good with a needle, which was one of the accomplishments my mother had taught me, and I converted that accomplishment from ornamental to functional, which is to say I used it to earn money rather than to decorate a parlor. I supported my mother and my sister. I paid the rent. I bought the food. I did what my mother could not do because she had not been built for doing, and I had built myself for nothing else. I married Pierre Moreau in 1872. Pierre was French Creole, a merchant who operated a dry goods store under the hill. He was not a bluff man, not society, not the sort of man Augusta Clement's daughter was expected to marry. My mother cried about this too. She cried because Pierre was beneath us, which was a remarkable thing to say for a woman who had descended every rung of Natchez society over the course of 20 years and who was at that point living in a house her 22-year-old daughter paid for with seamstress wages. Pierre was beneath us. I wanted to laugh. Instead, I married him. Pierre was the opposite of my father, steady, sober, paid his accounts weekly, never gambled, never speculated, never risked what he could not afford to lose, which was the single most attractive quality a man could possess in my estimation. Having watched my father risk everything and lose it and risk again and lose again until there was nothing left to risk except his liver, and he lost that too. Pierre was not exciting. He was not charming. He did not fill a room with his voice or his presence. He filled it with reliability, which is a quieter thing and a more durable one, and I loved him for it in my way, which was not my mother's way, not the weeping, adoring, helpless way, but a way that worked. Our love worked. It functioned. It held what it was meant to hold. My mother lived another 20 years after my father died. She lived with me and Pierre for most of those years, in the rooms above the dry goods store under the hill, which was as far from the Bluff as it was possible to get in Natchez without being in the river itself. She sat by the window in those rooms, and she looked up at the bluffs where she had lived as a girl, and she cried about the distance, which was both geographical and temporal, the distance between what she had been and what she had become, and I watched her cry, and I said nothing because there was nothing to say that the tears had not already said and said again, and said 1,000 times without producing any change. She was not a bad mother. I want to state this because what I have described might suggest otherwise. Augusta Trent loved her children. She loved us with a completeness that I have never questioned. Her love was real, and it was deep, and it was useless, because love without action is a beautiful thing that cannot feed anyone. She loved us, and she wept for us, and she could not protect us because protection was not part of her design. She was an ornament, and ornaments do not protect. They sit in their designated places, and they are beautiful, and when the house around them falls apart, they remain beautiful amid the rubble, and the beauty helps no one. She died on November the 6th, 1892. She was 66. The cause was exhaustion, though the physician called it something else, a weakening of the heart, a general decline. I called it exhaustion because that was what it was. She was exhausted from 44 years of crying, exhausted from producing tears for every crisis without ever producing a solution, exhausted from the effort of being helpless in a world that required capability, and from the shame of knowing she was helpless, and from the further shame of not knowing how to be otherwise. She was tired, my mother. She was tired in her body and in her spirit, and she died tired, and I was with her when she died, and I held her hand, and I did not cry. The funeral was at Trinity Episcopal, the church on the Bluff. My mother would have wanted that. to return to the Bluff one final time, carried up the hill in a coffin, entering through the front doors of the church her family had attended for 3 generations, surrounded by the people who had watched the Trent family's decline and who would now attend its conclusion with the appropriate mixture of sympathy and satisfaction that Natchez brought to other people's misfortunes. The church was full, not because my mother had been important, because death in Natchez was a social event and everybody attended regardless of their connection to the deceased, which was a tradition I found distasteful but which I did not have the energy to oppose. Cecile wept magnificently. Cecile had inherited our mother's gift for tears the way some daughters inherit their mother's eyes or their mother's singing voice. She wept with the fluency of a woman who had been practicing her entire life and who had now been given the ultimate occasion for her art. People surrounded her, people held her, people whispered about the devoted daughter, the tender heart, the depth of her love. Cecile was given the town's sympathy, wrapped in handkerchiefs and gentle hands, and murmured condolences, and I stood 6 feet away and received nothing except the sideways looks that constituted Natchez's judgment. I felt them, the tears. I need to tell you this because the defense I am mounting requires you to know that the absence of tears was not the absence of feeling. I felt them forming the way you feel a storm forming, a pressure behind the eyes, a heaviness in the chest, a tightening in the throat that precedes the release. My body wanted to cry. My body was trying to cry. Every physiological mechanism that produces tears was operating, producing the pressure, building the response, preparing to discharge 30 years of accumulated everything through 2 small ducts in the corners of my eyes. And I refused. I stood at my mother's coffin, and I refused my own body's demand. I refused because to cry at that funeral would have been to become my mother. To stand there weeping while the town watched would have been to complete the inheritance I had spent 30 years rejecting. Every tear I had not shed, every crisis I had managed instead of mourned, every meal I had produced instead of wept for, every creditor I had confronted instead of watched through blurred eyes, all of it would be erased by one public display of the very helplessness I had defined myself against. I could not permit it. If I cried, Augusta won. If I cried, the tears were hereditary after all, passed from mother to daughter like the piano playing in the French, and I would be Augusta, ornamental and helpless and beautiful in my grief and useless in every way that mattered. So I did not cry. I stood. I was dry. The town whispered. My sister wept. And I accepted the judgment because the alternative was to explain, and explaining would have meant saying aloud what I had never said, that my mother was helpless, that her tears were the evidence of her helplessness, that I had built my entire self in opposition to that helplessness, and that crying at her funeral would have been the destruction of everything I had built. I would not say this publicly because it would dishonor her. I would not dishonor my mother to defend myself to a town that had no right to judge either of us. That was 35 years ago. I have lived 35 years with the verdict. Cold, heartless, unnatural. I have worn it like a garment I did not choose but cannot remove. My children, 2 sons, grew up with a mother who did not cry. They saw me manage and organize and work and provide and stand upright in every circumstance. And they never saw me break because I did not break because I could not break, because breaking was what my mother did. And I would not do what my mother did. They grew up strong. They grew up capable. They also grew up, I suspect, uncertain of my love, because love in our house looked like competence rather than tenderness. And competence, however reliable, does not hold you the way tenderness does. Pierre understood. Pierre was the only person who understood because Pierre had seen my mother and had seen me, and had calculated the distance between us and had accepted that the distance was the price of my functionality. He never asked me to cry. never suggested I needed to, never told me I should soften or relent or permit the tears their passage. He simply loved me as I was, dry and capable and fierce in my refusal to be what my mother had been. He loved me, and when he died in 1920, I did not cry for him either, which was not a judgment on his worthiness, but a condition of my construction. I could not cry for him. I could not cry for anyone. The mechanism had been sealed shut for so long that the sealing had become permanent. I am 77 years old. I live alone in this house in Natchez, halfway up the bluff, neither at the top where I was born, nor at the bottom where my mother ended, but in the middle, which seems appropriate because the middle is where I've always been, between the bluff and the river, between the tears and the dryness, between my mother's helplessness and my own functionality, stranded in the space between the two things I understand and the one thing I do not, which is how to be both strong and soft at the same time. I have been thinking about my mother differently in recent years, not because I have softened with age, though perhaps I have, because I have begun to see something I could not see when I was young and full of my own certainty. My mother cried because crying was the only language her world gave her. She was not taught to act. She was not taught to manage. She was not taught to confront or negotiate or demand. She was taught to be beautiful and to cry, and she did both with consummate skill, and the fact that neither one saved her was not her failure. It was the failure of the world that built her, the world that took a girl of intelligence and capability and trained every ounce of capability out of her and replaced it with accomplishment, which is a different thing, and then expressed surprise when she could not function in a crisis. She cried because she had no other language, and I refused to cry because I saw her language as weakness, and I chose a different one. But my language, the language of action and dryness and refusal, my language is missing something too. My language cannot say I love you in a way that people can feel. My language cannot say I am hurt in a way that invites comfort. My language cannot say I am afraid in a way that allows someone to stand beside me and share the fear. My language is strong and clear and functional, and it is missing the one frequency that connects people to each other, which is the frequency of vulnerability, which is the frequency of tears. My mother had that frequency. She had it in abundance. She broadcast it constantly, and I shut it down because I associated it with helplessness, and I was right to associate it with helplessness in her case, but I was wrong to conclude that the frequency itself was the problem. The frequency was not the problem. The absence of everything else was the problem. My mother needed tears and action. She had tears without action, and it destroyed her. I had action without tears, and it has left me standing upright and alone in a house halfway up a bluff at 77 years old with a chest full of unfallen tears and no ability to release them. I tried recently. I will tell you this because it is the most honest thing I have said in this account, and honesty is what I have used to replace the tears my mother used to replace the action she could not take. I was sitting in my kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon in April. The magnolia outside the window was blooming. The river was high, brown, moving south the way it always moves, and I felt the pressure again, the same pressure from the funeral, the tears, 35 years of them accumulated behind my eyes like water behind a dam, and I thought, let them come. You are 77. You are alone. No one will see. No one will judge. Let them come. I sat there for an hour. I waited. I invited them. I tried to lower whatever barrier I had constructed between myself and the crying, the barrier I had been building since I was 8 years old, and walked 3 miles to my grandmother's house instead of weeping at the kitchen table. I tried to open the door my mother had never been able to close and that I had never been able to open. Nothing came. The pressure remained. The tears did not fall. The machinery for crying, disused for decades, would not engage. I had built myself so thoroughly into a woman who does not cry that the construction could not be reversed even by the architect who built it. I sat in that kitchen for an hour, trying to cry, unable to cry, and the irony of it was so complete that I almost laughed, which I could do. Laughing had never been taken from me, only crying, only the one thing I needed and could not produce. I'm going to say something to my mother now. I have been composing it for 35 years. It is not what the town wanted me to say. It is not what Cecile wanted me to say. It is what I need to say, and I will say it now because I am 77 and the bluff is eroding and the river is rising and I am running out of time. Mama, I did not cry at your funeral because I thought crying was the thing that kept you small. I thought your tears were the chains you wore, and I thought refusing them was freedom. I thought standing dry-eyed at your coffin was the strongest thing I could do for you, the greatest tribute I could pay, the proof that your daughter had escaped what you could not escape. I thought I was honoring you by being everything you were not. I am 77 years old, and I am no longer certain. Maybe your tears were not chains. Maybe they were the only voice your world allowed you. Maybe you spoke fluently in the only language you were given, and I, who refused to learn that language, have spent 35 years mute in a room full of feeling, with no way to let it out. You could cry and could not act. I could act and cannot cry. We were both trapped, Mama, just in different rooms. I would like to cry now. I would like to sit in this kitchen and cry for you the way you would have cried for me. But I have forgotten how. You took the tears with you when you went, and I did not ask for them back in time, and now they are in the ground with you, and I am up here, dry, and the distance between us is the same distance it always was. You below, me above, the bluff and the river and the whole long fall between.